Most people think their job is a personal choice. Where they work, what they earn, how secure their future feels. But that is no longer entirely true. Today, your job is part of something much bigger. It is shaped by trade policy, by industrial subsidies, by national security decisions made far from your workplace. Factories no longer move because labor is cheap. Jobs no longer disappear by accident. Entire industries are now protected or abandoned by design. This is not about left or right, and it is not about ideology. It is about power. Governments have quietly decided that work itself is strategic, and once jobs become strategic, they stop being neutral. The real question is not whether this is happening. The real question is what it means for people who still think the economy is apolitical. For most of modern history, work was treated as a private matter. People chose jobs, companies hired labor. Markets decided where industries grew or declined. Governments stayed mostly in the background. Economic policy focused on inflation, interest rates, and growth, not on where people worked or which jobs survived. That assumption no longer holds. Over the last decade, governments across advanced economies began reaching a quiet conclusion. Work itself had become strategic, not because politicians suddenly cared more about workers, but because jobs were tied to something larger. Supply chains, national security, technological dominance. A factory is no longer just a workplace. It is a node in a global system. When it shuts down, entire industries feel the shock. When it moves overseas, skills disappear with it. When it fails, governments step in, not out of compassion, but out of necessity. This is why certain jobs are now protected. Semiconductor engineers, energy technicians, defense manufacturers, critical infrastructure workers. These roles are no longer judged only by profitability. They are judged by risk. Risk to continuity, risk to sovereignty, risk to stability. At the same time, other jobs quietly lose protection. Industries exposed to foreign dependence, sectors vulnerable to geopolitical pressure, work deemed non-strategic. This is not accidental. Governments are no longer neutral observers of labor markets. They are participants. They influence where factories are built, which industries receive subsidies, which jobs are preserved, and which are allowed to vanish. This marks a fundamental shift. Work is no longer just an economic activity. It is a policy instrument. And once work becomes an instrument of strategy, the rules governing it change permanently. People still believe their jobs exist inside markets. In reality, those markets are now being shaped from above, quietly, deliberately, and with long-term intent. For decades, labor markets were assumed to be self-correcting. If one industry declined, another would rise. If jobs moved overseas, new ones would appear. If workers were displaced, retraining would absorb the shock. This belief shaped globalization. Manufacturing shifted to lower-cost regions. Services expanded in advanced economies. Efficiency was rewarded. Redundancy was removed. The system worked as long as conditions were stable. But stability disappeared. Global supply chains became longer and thinner. Just-in-time production replaced buffers. Skills concentrated in fewer locations. When shocks arrived, there was nothing left to absorb them. Factories closed suddenly. Entire regions lost employment at once. Workers were not displaced gradually, they were disconnected. Markets did not reallocate labor smoothly, they froze. During financial crises, hiring stopped. During pandemics, movement stopped. During geopolitical conflict, trade stopped. Workers could not simply move to the next opportunity because the next opportunity no longer existed locally. At the same time, governments realized something unsettling. The jobs that disappeared were often the ones they needed most: manufacturing capacity, energy production, logistics, technical skills. Once lost, these capabilities were not easily rebuilt. Training takes years. Infrastructure takes decades. Industrial ecosystems cannot be recreated overnight. Markets optimize for short-term efficiency. They do not preserve long-term capability. This exposed a flaw in the old assumption. Labor markets are efficient, but they are not resilient. They respond to price signals, not to national vulnerability. When labor markets failed to protect critical work, governments were forced to intervene, not to save every job, not to stop change, but to prevent irreversible loss. Loss of skills, loss of capacity, loss of control. This is where the shift began, not with ideology, not with politics, but with the realization that once work disappears from a country, power often disappears with it. Markets did not collapse, but trust in their ability to protect societies did. And once that trust was broken, governments began rewriting the rules. When labor markets stopped absorbing shocks, governments did not react immediately. They hesitated. For decades, intervention in labor markets was treated as distortion. Wage controls were discouraged. Industrial planning was dismissed. Job protection was framed as inefficiency. The prevailing idea was simple. Governments set the rules. Markets handled outcomes. But outcomes began producing instability. Unemployment concentrated geographically. Certain regions hollowed out. Entire skill bases vanished. At the same time, political pressure increased. Displaced workers did not disappear quietly. They voted, they protested, they rejected institutions that promised adjustment and delivered loss. Governments faced a new problem. Labor market failure was no longer just economic, it was political. And political instability carries costs markets cannot price. This is when the role of the state began to change. Not as an employer of last resort, not as a planner of every job, but as a stabilizer of labor capacity. Governments began linking employment to strategy. Subsidies were tied to domestic hiring. Infrastructure spending targeted specific regions. Training programs aligned with industrial priorities. This was not about preserving every job. It was about preserving capability. Skills that could not be outsourced. Work that could not be rebuilt quickly. Industries that underpinned national resilience. Labor policy became intertwined with security policy. Who produces energy matters. Who builds infrastructure matters. Who controls advanced manufacturing matters. Left entirely to markets, these jobs migrated to wherever costs were lowest. But lowest cost no longer meant lowest risk. Governments began setting conditions. If companies received support, they were expected to create jobs locally. If industries were strategic, their labor force had to be anchored. This marked a quiet shift. The labor market was no longer treated as neutral. It became something to be shaped, not permanently controlled, not centrally planned, but guided. Markets still determined wages and competition, but governments determined where work had to exist. This was not a rejection of capitalism. It was a recognition that labor is not just a factor of production. It is the foundation of social stability. And when markets could no longer guarantee that stability, the state stepped back in. For a long time, capital was treated as neutral. Money was expected to flow to wherever returns were highest, regardless of borders, politics, or strategy. This assumption shaped globalization. Factories moved. Investment crossed continents. Financial markets rewarded efficiency above all else. But neutrality depended on stability, and stability eroded. As risks accumulated, capital began behaving differently, not emotionally, not ideologically, strategically. Investors started asking new questions. What happens if regulations change suddenly? What happens if supply chains are disrupted? What happens if geopolitical tension freezes assets? Returns were no longer the only concern. Security entered the calculation. Governments noticed this shift, and instead of resisting it, they began shaping it. Policy stopped reacting to capital. Capital started responding to policy. Subsidies altered investment decisions. Tax incentives redirected factory locations. Regulatory frameworks signaled which industries were protected. Capital followed the signals, not because investors preferred intervention, but because uncertainty is expensive. A lower return inside a stable framework became preferable to higher returns exposed to disruption. This changed the role of the state. Governments were no longer just regulators of markets. They became architects of investment environments. If capital wanted access, it had to align. If firms wanted support, they had to commit. This did not eliminate private decision-making. It constrained the range of acceptable choices. Capital still moved freely, but within boundaries. Those boundaries were political. Energy investment followed climate policy. Technology investment followed data regulation. Manufacturing investment followed industrial incentives. This was not coercion, it was conditioning. Governments did not tell capital where to go. They made certain destinations safer than others. Over time, this reshaped economic geography. Investment clustered around policy certainty. Regions with strategic alignment attracted funding. Areas outside those frameworks declined. Capital ceased to be blind. It became selective. And once capital becomes selective, markets stop being neutral arenas. They become structured spaces where power is exercised indirectly, not through orders, not through ownership, but through the environment in which decisions are made. This is how economic control now operates, quietly, systemically, and with lasting consequences. For decades, globalization followed a simple logic: trade widely, source cheaply, integrate deeply. The assumption was that interdependence reduced risk. In practice, it redistributed it. As supply chains stretched across continents, countries gained efficiency, but lost control. When disruptions were rare, the system appeared resilient. When disruptions became frequent, its weaknesses surfaced. Governments learned a hard lesson. Dependence without trust is exposure. This changed how cooperation worked. Instead of open-ended globalization, states began prioritizing alignment, not with everyone, but with those they could rely on. Economic relationships started to resemble alliances. Trade agreements became strategic instruments. Supply chains were redesigned around political compatibility. Technology sharing followed security frameworks. This was not isolation, it was filtration. Access became conditional. Countries were no longer evaluated only on cost or capacity, but on reliability, governance, and alignment. Who shares standards? Who enforces contracts? Who honors commitments during stress? These questions replaced price as the primary filter. As a result, globalization did not disappear. It reorganized. Production clustered within trusted regions. Investment favored allied economies. Critical resources were secured through partnerships rather than markets. This reduced vulnerability, but increased fragmentation. The world economy began forming blocks, not rigid camps, but overlapping networks of cooperation. Each network prioritized continuity over scale. Efficiency gave way to redundancy. Speed gave way to resilience. This shift also changed leverage. When access depends on membership, rules become tools of inclusion and exclusion. Standards determine participation. Compliance determines opportunity. Economic power now flows through networks, not just markets, and networks are governed. This explains why trade disputes now escalate quickly, why technology restrictions spread rapidly, why supply chains are increasingly politicized. The system is no longer global by default. It is global by permission. This does not end growth, but it changes who benefits from it. Countries inside trusted networks gain stability. Those outside face volatility. Globalization continues, but under supervision. And once cooperation becomes conditional, economics becomes inseparable from strategy. The market did not fail. It was repurposed. What we are witnessing is not a temporary adjustment. It is a structural shift in how power is exercised. Markets still allocate resources, but they no longer decide direction alone. That role has moved back to the state, not through control of prices, but through control of conditions. Governments now shape outcomes before markets react. They define which industries are protected, which technologies scale, which relationships are trusted. This changes how democracy functions. Economic decisions that once appeared neutral are now openly political. Subsidies become policy statements. Regulation becomes strategy. Trade becomes leverage. Citizens feel this shift, even if they cannot always name it. Jobs reappear in some regions and vanish in others. Prices stabilize in one sector while rising in another. Opportunities follow policy, not just talent. This increases accountability, but also tension. When the state guides the economy, its choices carry visible consequences. Who benefits? Who bears the cost? Who decides? These questions move from boardrooms into public debate. At the same time, power becomes quieter. There are fewer dramatic announcements, fewer clear turning points. Change happens through frameworks, standards, and long-term commitments. Once embedded, these systems are difficult to reverse. Markets adapt, institutions adjust, expectations reset. The result is a new balance. Less volatility, but less neutrality. More stability, but more politics. This is not a return to the past. It is an adaptation to a world where risk is permanent and interdependence is unavoidable. The most important decisions shaping the next decade are not being made in moments of crisis. They are being made now, quietly, incrementally, through economic architecture. The real question is not whether this shift is good or bad. The question is whether societies understand how deeply it is already underway. Because once power moves into systems, it rarely moves back out. And by the time it becomes visible, the rules are already set. Breaking news is fast. Understanding takes time. If this helped you see the story more clearly, stay with us.